The Sound of Footsteps. Written by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Read to you by Frankie Corzo.
"Do you remember our ghost?" he asked. They'd ducked into a hipster cafe with the logo of a sickle and a hammer above the door. It had seemed funny ironic to sit at the long stainless steel table drinking a tiny cup of coffee. The menu offered the Marxist mix and the Mocha Lenin. But after a while, sneering at the decor and the clientele lost its appeal. They stared at each other in silence, neither one of them knowing what to say. Perhaps that's why he brought the ghost up. To have something to say, anything, or else a stray detail had sparked his memory. "The illiterate ghost," she said, nodding and chuckled, because half of the time when they brought the Ouija board and asked, "Are you here?" the ghost spelled things like XYHLNMA or QTSOALF. "Bernal, we baptized it," he said. "That was his name." "Yes, such nonsense." "I don't know. There was something sometimes, wasn't there? Especially that last time." She frowned. Yeah, there had been something, but it was hard to say what. It was merely a feeling, the air going heavy, something pressing against you. Like a thumb against a plastic CD case, resting hard against it until the case cracked. Something about to snap. It was the moment right before the crack appears on the surface. "I'm not sure. We were drunk when we did that shit," she said, and waved the memory away. The silence, like the dead space between song tracks, fell upon them once more. She was bored, and his face, hollowed out, the skin leathery and marked with sores, was painful to look at. "The record store's still standing," he said. "What? It's open?" "I didn't say it's open, but it's there. We could go check it out, you know." "Oh, well, it's getting late. Come on," he said, grabbing his backpack. "Come on, it's only a few blocks away." They went. Each block they walked, the shiny modern businesses and little restaurants grew sparser, until they reached a block that looked almost untouched by the tsunami of gentrification which had swallowed their childhood neighborhood. There it was, at the corner, the 2-story building. The windows on the ground floor had gone blind, shielded by pieces of cardboard and old newspapers, and the front door was sprayed with graffiti. She placed her hands in her pockets and surveyed the ruin of their teenagehood. "Let's go to the back," he said. "What for?" He didn't reply. She followed him there and he took out a key. This is how they'd gotten into the building. He worked there and lifted a copy of the manager's key so they could let themselves in any time they wanted. But she assumed they'd changed the lock. She was wrong. He opened the door, and she used her cell phone to light the way inside, until she stood in the middle of the ground floor. In a corner there was an old cash register, and a couple of shelves had been left by the front door. There was the scent of humidity, of 1,000 rains which had fallen since she'd last been there. "Come on, let's go up," he said, and he hurried up the stairs before she could call into question the expedition. The windows on the second floor had not been blinded with newspaper, and the streetlights illuminated this area. The green of a neon sign turning the wall in front of her emerald. There were boxes with empty CD cases piled around them, rolled-up posters for concerts of a previous decade. A large framed picture of Kurt Cobain rested against the wall. It sure didn't smell like Teen Spirit here anymore. She stared at the black and white picture, the singer's lips slightly parted, his eyes staring at her from across time. "Are you here?" she thought. Like an echo, and like an echo too in her memory, their giggling. Their jokes, the sound of the planchette sliding against the board, the pulse quickening and that pact they'd made, even if she was squeamish about real blood. "Hey, we should—" She turned around, ready to leave, but he'd taken out 3 veladores from the backpack and a Ouija board. They'd both been darguetos, but she recited Rimbaud and played The Cure or La Sangre de Alicia in the last gasping months of the decade, while he spent his time reading about Crowley and mediums, buying skulls and silver jewelry around El Chopo. Hence the half-assed seances, cutting their palms and pressing them together. The ghost. That was him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I thought it might be fun," he replied. "One last turn around the board and all that." He had with him a tiny but powerful portable speaker, which he synced with his phone, and the sounds of Las Animas del Cuarto Oscuro invaded the abandoned store. She remembered that record's cover. The eye with all the mascara, and the mascara clumping on her lashes, the foundation caking on her skin, crimson lipstick carefully applied, mouthing the lyrics. "Don't be silly. Would a drink help?" He took out a flask and tipped it in her direction. She ought to say no, but the emerald green of the neon sign and perhaps the mere joy of playing this game again had softened his features. Nothing could be done about the hollowness of his face, but the wrinkles and the marks on his skin were half erased, lending him to look of someone much younger, the illusion completed by the upturned collar of his black jacket. She took the flask and took a sip, walked in front of the windows and through the buildings across the street to look. She itched for a cigarette, but she'd quit it a decade ago. She hadn't thought about smoking in ages, but the record store, the liquor going down her throat, his mere presence, they revived old vices. "Someone's going to call the cops on us if we stay around here," she said. "The neighbors will notice something's up." "No one's going to call anyone. It's not like we'll light 1,000 candles. The noise, they don't mind the noise. Make a circle of salt, or draw a pentagram with chalk. Tell ghost stories until the crack of dawn. Wash any tingling fears with watered-down booze." That had been a lifetime ago, and she'd enjoyed it. But now it seemed ridiculous. They'd grown up, grown apart, grown out of it. She had. He took out a box with matches and struck one, glancing at her before he pressed the flame against the wick. She stared at him, sliding her hands into her back pockets and sighing. He took that as a yes and lit the 3 veladoras. There were no chairs, so they dragged a couple of sagging boxes and sat by the table. He dispensed with the salt circle and the invocation. Instead, they placed their hands against the planchette. It slid across the board, left and right. But after a little while he lifted his hands and sighed. She understood why. There wasn't that free zone of fear, of that something which they'd caught on occasion. There wasn't the enjoyment they derived even when there wasn't anything. It was dull work to watch him, earnest head bowed over the board, while she was trying to compose a decent goodbye which wouldn't sound too curt. Green went the sign, flashing green and pausing and green again, a lonesome telegraph operator trying to convey a message. It lit his face dramatically as he arched his head to stare at the ceiling, as if looking for their ghost somewhere on the roof. It had been he who asked for this reunion, after hearing down the grapevine that she was visiting the city, and she had not demurred, excited by the idea of visiting old haunts, of dissecting distant memories, of opening dusty albums, but their conversation had petered out rather quickly at the cafe, and here it was even worse. "Perhaps if we try closer to midnight it might work better," he said, lifting his hands, unscrewing the top of his flask and taking a swig. He had taken many. They had been at this for a long time. She was beyond boredom. "I can't stay that late." "Why? What are you doing tomorrow?" Her day was wide open, but she thought if she said that he might think it was an invitation to hang out again. "I have a business lunch and after that other meetings," she lied. "They run you pretty ragged at that company, don't they?" "It pays the bills." "It has nothing to do with music." I wanted to be a musician for one split second. "Oh no," he said, shaking his head. "I remember our demo. In fact, I have a copy of it somewhere." She blushed at the memory of that, having managed to forget entirely that she had ever dared to commit her inane lyrics about lovers that meet in a graveyard to physical form. But now she recalled there had been a CD, with a cover. In imitation of Las Ánimas del Cuarto Oscuro, it was a close-up of a mouth. She'd made herself. She played the electric guitar, he had the keyboard. Main vocals for her because they both thought a girl singing would be a more novel act and he was shyer. Backing vocals for him, then. Her voice had been sharp, perfect for Riot Grrrl fans. But they were about 5 years too late for that, and this wasn't a Riot Grrrl act anyway. His voice had been black treacle, much too cloying, much too everything, unrefined and unable to hit all the high notes on their cover of Bela Lugosi's Dead, which rounded up the demo. She couldn't even write 4 whole songs to prove her mettle as a lyricist and had to pad it. There had been a line going round and round the block, and she recalled walking in, belting a song, handing the demo and a sheet of paper to the board people doing a talent search that summer. She recalled, too, the girl who won. The crest smile and hair like corn silk. 100 copies of a demo stuffed into a box and left to molder in some corner of the store. Silly. It was silly. I didn't have the singing skills any more than you were going to conjure the ghost of Napoleon. And yet ghosts gave me my big break. I managed some pieces on Paranormal Activity for Enigma, he said. The parent company owned several other magazines, owned a paper. I moved on to those. It was 11 good years until, layoffs, downsizing, and then, rather understated. She knew even if he had not said it that he was living with his mother, had been living there for ages. And if he filed any pieces these days, she was pretty sure where that money went by the looks of him. The grapevine which announced her presence in the city also went the other way around, and warned her he was prone to asking for money, and he was a junkie doing a bad imitation of Bukowski, which maybe was in line with who they'd been in their youth, with their po this and po that. Don't trust that guy. That's what they said now. Now? His hair like raven wings, sprinkled with too many gray hairs, greasy. She shouldn't judge this way, she knew that. She should be kind and polite. But he looked like a skeleton which had crawled itself out of the grave, and his idea of merriment with the Ouija, it made things worse. She ran a finger over the Ouija board, tracing the letters. B-E-R-N-A-L. Then the other way around. L-A-N-R-E-B. Now might be the time. No, he said quickly. No, please. Let's just wait until midnight. Let's see if we can try again, all right? I've tried it before without you, but it doesn't work. I think it might need the both of us here. You've tried what? Using the Ouija board? Coming here? She asked. Yes, he said. Of course he had. She ought to have known. She imagined him pathetically lighting his candles each week, playing his music and invoking the spirits who never arrived. No wonder he didn't fear the neighbors seeing them across the street. They must be used to his visits. It was a game, she said. We bought the board at a toy store. I know, but there was something. You said it yourself. I didn't say that, she protested. You're putting words in my mouth. You wouldn't be here if there hadn't been something. There were 2 dumb, bored kids, she said. And maybe if she had said it differently, with a smile, with a wink, it would have gone down smoothly and he would have laughed. But there was cold derision in her voice, and not for the kids they'd been, but for him. Him now. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He tensed his jaw. And then there was one bored kid. Where'd you go, huh? Why didn't you bother to say hi until I messaged you? He asked roughly. I'll die of feeling, he'd told her once when they'd eagerly anticipated their demise, and he said he must be buried in a white linen suit, only lilies at the funeral, which to her at that point had seemed the height of sophistication. But then he'd taken it too far, as he always did. Week after week the talk of death, skulls, ghosts, and she was bitter with the failure of the demo. She did not want to prance around dressed in black with silver crucifixes around her neck and rosaries wrapped around their wrists. She began to roll her eyes at him, And then she told the others who comprised the rest of their social circle that they'd been right, that he was way too weird, and their friendship rotted as quickly as cut flowers. She saw it all again, like in fast motion, their whole history, and did not wish to see it. "You know what? I'm not doing this," she said, shoving the chair back and standing up. "They warned me about you." "They? Like what? The people you did keep in touch with? Sarah had a kid, you sent a little blanket. Tito got married, you were invited to the wedding. I didn't mean you cut me out." "I have meetings tomorrow," she said, trying to deflect him. "Important meetings, yes. You're so important. Just go. Get out." Tears, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder. She was no Eurydice. He didn't follow her, thankfully, and she was even more thankful when he didn't message her again. They'd told her he could be persistent. He stuck like glue. Maybe he'd sensed he couldn't guilt her into lending him money like the others had, and thankfully she didn't wonder what was up with him after that. But then, a year later, down the grapevine once more came the news. Dead. He was dead. Not the romantic suicide they'd discussed in their teenage years, drunk on imaginary melancholy. For her Orpheus, head torn apart, an image out of John William Waterhouse, and he a pistol in his hand, upon the bed courtesy of Manet. A matching set. It tickled their fancy. "I'll die of feeling," he'd said. But he died jaywalking, hit by a car near a street where reliably you could buy all kinds of drugs to dull the senses. 3 months later, she was in the city again, more business stuff. She went to the record shop, stood outside it and looked at the graffiti, read the faded headlines on the newspaper plastered against the glass. In her handbag there was a key. She'd received it in the mail along with a forgotten CD. Her demo, his fingerprints all over the shiny surface of the disc. She walked up the steps and stood in the middle of the room. She had no candles and no Ouija board. She sat on one of the sagging boxes in front of the table and touched the scar, almost invisible, made with a jagged green piece of bottle which she'd smashed. The promise made in a whisper, forever and ever. A kid's promise. To never break a bond, friends, eternity, us. A thread so easily, carelessly snipped in two. But then, you can't really die of feeling, and you can't remain trapped in a moment eternally. She'd figured that out. Except now, she wished to believe it was possible to remain. She looked around the dark. "Are you here?" she asked. She wasn't asking for Bernal this time. She sat in the empty husk of the store, much too old to even consider the question, but asking it nevertheless. Asking it to the walls and the floor and the posters on the wall. If fingerprints can remain, smudged upon a CD that skips, maybe you can skip back in other ways. She squeezed her eyes shut, counting to 100, losing the count, blinking and staring at the wall. The green light shone bright, and she sniffled, dabbing at her nose with her t-shirt. She gripped the table with both hands and thought of all those silly stories he'd told her about seances where tables flew up in the air, poltergeists knocking chandeliers down, ectoplasm coalescing into balls of light. She wouldn't ask for that much. She knotted her hands together and pressed her lips against her fingers, as if praying. But instead of praying, she hummed a tune, the first track on their demo. She didn't know what else to do. It was he who knew about candles for summoning spirits or circles of salt. She only understood yearning. Then there was that feeling of something, plastic breaking, that moment right before the crack appears on the surface. She heard footsteps coming up the stairs. A voice like treacle spoke behind her, and she turned her head eagerly, wiping the tears from the corner.